I think it's the sort of thing that's much easier to see in hindsight than in foresight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you won't know what the real communism was the friends we made along the way.
Damn straight.
Hey.
Welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread.
Yes, welcome to Left Unread, a podcast where two dudes engage in a radical self-education. My name is Aaron.
My name is Will.
And this week, we are reading
Socialism, Utopian and Scientific
Correct.
by Frederick Engels.
That is correct. And for those that are interested in getting the exact editions that we're reading, because we are probably going to be dropping page numbers.
Yes, indeed.
We are both reading from the well-read books. What do you fucking call it? The Classics of Marxism, Volume 1.
Yes, Marxist Classics, Volume 1. Bright orange cover. Lovely industrial style font on the front. I'm happy to have it.
Yeah, and it's good. It's got the manifesto. It's got what we've read this go-round, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's got the State and Revolution and a Trotsky thing that we haven't / maybe will never read.
That's right. Well-read books, they're Trotskyites.
Oh yeah, they're Trots.
They're Trots!
He's a Trot!
This work here, written by Engels, of course.
Mm-hmm. Is that a unicorn
yes,
on your bookmark?
It's holographic, too. It's such a banger. Just a brief side note, people leave so many bookmarks in their books that I have amassed a collection. We've filled up like 4 cups with bookmarks, which is great because we have a huge library.
Yeah.
We're never buying a bookmark again.
I didn't mean to cut you off in the middle of your thought there, though. Sorry.
I already forgot what the thought was. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It was written by Frederick Engels. It's actually part of a larger piece, Anti-Düring, which is a polemical work against a German philosopher named Düring.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Herr Düring. It's pretty fun. I don't think it's in the chapter here, but basically in one of the introductions I read, they say that Düring sprang forth and said, "I'm now a socialist. And not only that, but I've concocted the perfect socialist plan in my mind." And in response to that, Engels wrote Anti-Düring, to which this book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, hard to call it a book, it's only 40-something pages, is just 3 chapters lifted. But I think they're 3 really nice chapters that put together into a lovely little primer almost here. And that's the way I took this book to go. Because the first edition I ordered was the whole of Anti-Düring, and the format of that book was so nasty, I just decided to go ahead and get this version.
No, and I get also why this would have been excerpted. Mm-hmm. It feels very much like something that would have come from a pamphlet because that's exactly what they did. And I like that you called it a primer. I think it works very well in that way. And I think it has a very clear, linear kind of thought process between the 3 chapters.
Yes.
That sets you on a really, I think, positive course. And frankly, I have a much stronger understanding of historical materialism now than I did before reading it, which I think is kind of the point.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. You know, the whole chapter 2 is on dialectics. I think this might be the first time where I felt the most comfortable kind of looking through that lens. You know, I have a better understanding now of what dialectical thinking might be than before, which kind of came from, I don't know, just bits and pieces that I've scrounged off of the internet, really. I've never done any kind of reading before in that department specifically.
Yeah, I'll say coming from a world of having read quite a lot of philosophy, studied a little bit, I have never read any Hegel. And so it's become quite clear that Marx and Engels were Hegelians, were very wedded to the Hegelian kind of ideology. And so when I hear the word dialectics, I'm thinking of it through a Greek lens, a Platonic lens, like thinking about Socrates specifically. You know, Euthyphro is a pretty famous dialectical work that Plato wrote. It's a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro. And that's what I think of when I think of dialectics, as a dialogue between 2 characters or 2 people that present some sort of philosophical, kind of underpinned by some philosophical motive.
Isn't that where like the master and the dialect of the master and slave come from, like that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
I am like very marginally familiar with those concepts as well. But I've always taken those kind of hand in hand in the same way. You know, even like the master and slave, it's like one cannot exist without the other.
Yeah, and it never really clicked with me how, having never read any Hegel, it never really clicked with me why the Marxists were using dialectics so much. I'm thinking of it in that kind of classical Greek way, and I'm like, I'm not seeing the connections here to contradiction. You know, and I started, I think, finally it kind of clicked at some point getting through this.
Yeah.
For me.
No, it's definitely same. I think chapter 2 was, as we kind of talked about a little bit, reading through chapter 1 is interesting from a historical perspective, but it's maybe not the most thrilling thing. But once I hit chapter 2 and onwards, I really was, most of this book is highlighted. It's pretty, I had a good time with it.
Yeah, I thought it was good. You know, what's interesting is I feel like in a lot of these works, we're getting through the beginning. I feel like we said the same thing about imperialism,
Yeah.
where it's like they spend so much time setting things up and it doesn't get interesting until the end.
Yeah.
But I think that what makes it interesting is built on the foundation of what they're establishing at the beginning. So like this kind of historical context that he's doing at the start of this, the first chapter, like, okay, whatever, I wasn't really all that bought into it, but I do feel like having read that made the impact of chapters 2 and 3 much stronger because we were all coming from it from the same historical vantage.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It also gives you the benefit of understanding the historical references that he is then immediately afterwards making,
Yeah.
If you were to just reference, Saint-Simon or Fourier.
Fourier. Moliere.
Just off the cuff, though, I would glaze over those. Like, it wouldn't mean anything to me. Now that I have that first chapter context, it makes those references much more powerful, and also it gives more credence to those people. Additionally, what I was going to say is that just to talk a little bit about the big three that the three utopian socialists that he mentions, though, I had not heard of Robert Owens before, but it's interesting because his kind of philosophy is similar to one that I had kind of come to really early on when I was studying economics, where I had this idea where it's not anything novel. It's just the idea that, like, if your only expense you can cut is like an expense towards your employees, then like that's not a sound business practice,
Mm-hmm.
He's like taking the most numerical, statistical example of capitalism and just saying like it is more productive to arrange things in this way where your employees are being lifted up. And I just found that to be really refreshing from, I don't know, maybe at an economic standpoint, that it's just like, it is actually a more practical business decision to just not be an exploitative dickhead, imagine.
Yeah, it made me think, I mean, maybe I was interpreting it a little bit incorrectly or perhaps too cynically, but it made me think of the supposed benevolent capitalists, the like Dan Prices of the world or whatever.
Which so funny because he was like a flash in the pan of like, I'm a good guy, and then it's like, actually, he's an abusive asshole is what came to light.
What do you know?
Yeah, imagine that, a CEO, not a good person. But, I mean, even just to quote him here, this is on page 47 in chapter 1. In spite of all of this, first, the page above talks about his factory in New Lanark, Scotland, where it was a model colony. Drunkenness, police, magistrates, lawsuits, poor laws, and charity were unknown. Right? That's our anarchist utopia right there.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit further down, the relatively favorable conditions in which he had placed them were still far from allowing a rational development of the character and intellect in all directions, much less of the free exercise of their facilities. And then it quotes Owens. And yet, the working part of this population of 2,500 persons was daily producing as much real wealth for society as, less than half a century before, it would have required the working part of a population of 600,000 to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000? The answer was clear. This is back to Engels. It had been used to pay the proprietors of the establishment 5% on the capital they had laid out, in addition to over 300,000 pounds clear profit. So, like, a better capitalism even is possible. That's not our goal here, but I don't know. It's like by the rules of the game, they have to be the most ruthless and exploitative. It is possible to act better, but they don't do it because it's not in their own interest.
Yes, I think the idea of a better capitalism is one that still has profit for the capitalists, but doesn't wring out every possible cent of possible profit by exploiting everyone to the point, to the furthest degree that they will allow themselves to be exploited.
Yeah.
Not in a way to sound like a victim blamer or something like that, but you know what I mean, to the point that revolution will not ensue.
Right. It's just the furthest stretch.
Yeah, but it is possible. There is a middle ground in there somewhere where probably people could live a reasonably good life as a wage worker, and the capitalist could still make all of this profit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm missing your point there, but...
I mean, no, I think that's exactly what I'm saying. It's just really funny because... even thinking about it in developmental stages, the fact that Robert Owens is able to take these 2,500 people and get the work out of them that over 500,000 people would have taken 50 years ago, which is a long time, but it's really not that much time.
I mean, especially at this point in history. I mean, I guess this is like at the onset of industrialization, but
I don't know. Just had some thoughts. I thought that it was nice historical context here.
Yeah. So I had a couple of thoughts about this. This is maybe meta-textual to the text, our approach to it. Number one, you mentioned Carissa's listening to the episodes, but not doing the reading.
Yeah.
My dad is listening to the episodes, but not doing the reading. I'm getting the impression that probably most people aren't doing the reading and are maybe seeing this as a supplement to it. Best case, probably maybe being like, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll read it afterward.
Read it. That's been my best case scenario also.
And so that makes me wonder if we have a duty to do some more deliberate summarization. And especially in a work like this, it's so clearly categorized, like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Does it make sense at the start to say, like, chapter 1 is covering this, chapter 2 covers this, chapter 3 covers this?
I think it does. The lazy person in me says fuck them, but I think that we should do that. This is something I've thought of before too.
Yeah, we've had this conversation before, and I recall very strongly having the opinion of like, that's not the purpose of the podcast. But it seems that intention and impact are not always in alignment.
Right. It might be better suited to the actual audience than our perceived audience to do some summary.
Yeah, the way the audience seems to be interacting with the show is maybe not exactly what we had intended. Not that it's wrong or anything like that.
I know what you mean.
The point of the show, the reason we decided to start doing it was like, well, we want to engage with this work and we want to engage other people that are interested in engaging in this work. Mm-hmm. And maybe those examples are bad because those are people that are inherently supportive of us regardless. And so they're not coming to it like, I want to learn more about communism, so to speak. Yeah. You know what I mean? So maybe the other 9 to 12 people that are listening to the show.
Hey, listener, write in at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com and tell us if this makes any sense to you.
Yeah.
I know. See, that's the problem, though, is because, like, I don't know if we're going to have an answer to that until we have more people engaging with us.
That's fair. The other problem is that I'll end up cutting a lot of, if not all of this from the episode anyway. Maybe it does stand to reason to leave a section in asking those questions at some point.
Like the summary questions?
Yeah. Like posing them to the audience.
I think it would probably be beneficial just to kind of, maybe at the start, after we introduce the book, just to recap the main ideas. And then we can kind of dive in. Because I think that I do enjoy the freewheeling kind of conversation that we have, but I still think that the topic structure that we had in the beginning was maybe a little more suited for our conversation, you know?
Yeah, well, so what we were battling was when we were outlining it more rigidly, we felt beholden to the outline, and it stilted things. Mm-hmm. Once we've eliminated the outline, now we like even last week or the week before, I think, it was kind of like we went through the whole conversation. We didn't even talk about this, which is a pretty important part of the book, because we've been, maybe it's somewhere between the minimum and maximum program.
Fucking Trotsky.
But like this one is a good example of like maybe we should have some sort of structure. Like let's talk about chapter 1, let's talk about chapter 2, let's talk about chapter 3.
Yeah. That's actually what I was thinking for this book, was just to go chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3.
So in the spirit of going in the order of the chapters, the first chapter is called The Development of Utopian Socialism. My take on it is that generally, like we said before, it's just giving kind of a historical context to these thinkers that had this kind of, I would characterize it as overly utopian idea of what socialism is or could be. Yeah. And Engels is just trying to lay all of that out for us.
Yeah. The thing I appreciate here is that he's really making it clear that they're talking about, the idea of like rationality and reason. And this age that these people were living in gave birth to their thought. They were living in an age of like the kingdom of reason, all of society's ills could be thought out to be dealt with. Like it just took the more intelligent man to think of the solution and then to put it into action. And thusly, these thinkers were saying, we can just create the perfect system out of our minds. The reason that Engels brings all this up is to contrast it with a materialistic conception in which it's being built off of, the previous conditions. So I think it really is, it's both good and important to have the basis of their thinking in mind here, because it is so different to where scientific socialism is coming from in the end of the day. I love this quote on page 39. It's right in the second page. We know today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie, that this eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice. This equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law.
Yep.
So just that, like, in your mind conception of the perfect society does lead to a sense of equality here, but at the end of the day, it is a bourgeois equality. It's not truly equal in the sense that, all men are taken care of, all humans, I suppose.
Yes. I don't have anything to add to that. I think you said that exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, it's laid out really well. The French Revolution being a revolution in the sense that they're challenging these traditional notions and trying to replace them with rational logic. The world that came out of that is that bourgeois rationality. Engels furthers this distinction on the next page, says cash payment becomes more and more the sole nexus between man and man. I mean, you're starting to see those social relations be strained by the conditions of the society around it.
Yeah. So to the point of it being a bourgeois justice, a bourgeois kind of conception, he says on page 40, one thing is common to all three of these men that he's outlined in the chapter. Not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of that proletariat, which historical development had in the meantime produced.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it feels very elementary, very basic as an assumption or a conclusion to come to. But it's fair. Like, the conditions that were evolving around these folks were creating a class of proletarians that were not being represented in this imaginary conception of what society could be.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about one thing Engels says that Saint Simon's big contribution is that
Saint Simon.
I know I kept wanting to say Saint Simon. I'm looking here on page 44. Already in his Geneva letters, Saint Simon lays down the proposition that all men ought to work. Just thought that was interesting. In that same work, he recognizes also the reign of terror was the reign of the non-possessing masses. So his essential contribution is that he's saying that the revolution was ultimately a class struggle. It's just that the prevailing party was not the non-possessing class. It was the bourgeois ultimately.
Yeah.
Right? Just to keep reading, he says, "See," he says to them, "what happened in France at the time when your comrades held sway there. They brought about a famine." Just an interesting little nod to the conquest of bread in my mind. But to recognize the French Revolution as a class war, and not simply one between nobility and bourgeoisie, but between nobility, bourgeoisie, and non-possessors, was in 1802 a most pregnant discovery.
I found that an odd turn of phrase.
I know. Just, there's more in there, like another whole person. That's like a pregnant person. Awful. They're men at the end of the day,
Yeah.
I mean, this is like a semantical thing. But all of these works where they're talking about, whenever they're referring to one, they're referred to them as man.
Mm-hmm.
Just to, yeah.
That's called androcentrism. Critical feminist theorists would know.
Thank you, because I don't know. I know, like, in my mind palace, I can sort those things out. But
my mind palace?
It's interesting, though. Fuck all this. We're moving on here.
Well, here's something interesting. This is not a comment with great depth, but the very first thing that we read together for this show was a work by Engels.
Yeah.
And in it, I found some of the interesting things that he talked about in principles were around marriage. Mm-hmm. And obviously he wrote Origin of the Family.
Yeah.
And he goes into that pretty deeply. I don't know where this work is in the relative to the timeline of his entire oeuvre, but he has an interesting comment about marriage here also that I just stood out to me and I wanted to point out on page 41.
Yeah.
It's at the bottom of the page. He's talking about the way these kind of wealth transferences were occurring. And in the middle of this paragraph at the bottom of the page, the right of the first knight was transferred from the feudal lords to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased to an extent never heard of. Marriage itself remained as before, the legally recognized form, the official cloak of prostitution. Yeah. And he's obviously got a lot to say about the kind of power dynamic, the differential that comes in marriage, along with the institution of marriage, in an interesting way that just reading through this, I was like, I want to know more about your opinion on that.
Maybe at some point we definitely should read about, the origins of private property in the family, just to think about marriage as a transaction.
It 100% has historically been a transactional.
Yeah, exactly. Thing. I mean, that's the thought I literally just had. It's like you arrange a marriage, you give a wedding gift, a dowry, right? That's literally a transaction in which you're buying a prostitute. I mean,
let me sell you my daughter.
Yeah, yes. For what purpose, by the way? Everyone knows.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. And it's just, that was a shock to me just now. I had not really ever had that thought in that sense before.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's why the conversation around names is still kind of a rot.
I love the word rot. It's great. On page 43, I love this quote here. This really made me relate to what we've been talking about like the social form that needs to be created in order to then create this society we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
These new social systems were foredoomed as utopian. The more completely they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasies. That quote just kind of spoke to me because it makes me think about the conversations we've had about, this idea of creating the perfect state, which will then wither away or whatever, as Kropotkin says, to create a state that directs the intentions of man and still serves them, The problem I have with Kropotkin is that he said that was an insoluble problem. And maybe I'm in more agreement with him now, that to try
Come to the dark side.
Yeah, to like put forth an answer to that problem is to miss the purpose of the question. The question is the more important thing here. And that is something that we need to be aware of. Just to put forth a solution and say, this is the solution, now it's done and washed, done and dusted. That's maybe the wrong way of looking at it. Instead, it might be better to put forth a solution and then hammer it out.
Yeah, I really think perfection is the enemy of good enough, or in this case, perfection is the enemy of better.
Yeah.
And not to sound like I'm advocating for reform over revolution, but I don't think we have a perfect conception of what the state will look like in it, or how to move to a state that will gradually wither away. I don't think we have that perfect conception. Maybe that's because we haven't studied enough, as you and I personally are not principled enough as communists to conceive of that. Maybe it's because the conditions in which we exist make it impossible to see from this particular point of view. Maybe that's capitalist realism or something like that speaking. But the idea that would hinder us from moving forward or trying something else, I think ultimately is beneficial to the capitalist class. And so moving forward and trying something is certainly better. And hopefully it could evolve into that more idealized or utopian or kind of state.
It's just a kind of appreciation that I got more from reading this, especially chapter 2. I think I said this in the last episode, though, where I was thinking about it dialectically. And at that point, even just 2 weeks ago, I was speaking more naively. And I said that maybe we'll come up with an approximation, something that's close enough that we can work from that point. And I think that, again, I agree with you that this is dangerously close to a reformist ideal, but the idea that we could, it's like a stepping stone, If you take one step forward, you can now see one step forwarder, Oh, God. you know what I mean, though? It's like we're now closer to the goal, maybe more so that you can now see it. I think that kind of thinking is more beneficial than like this idea of a perfect revolution or a perfect state or a perfect form.
Yes, if I can get literary for a moment.
Yeah, by all means.
Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God opens with one of the most beautiful metaphors. In this case, I think it's something about self-actualization and becoming the perfect form of yourself, the perfect version of yourself.
Yeah.
And she opens it talking about the horizon and ships at sea and looking out at the horizon. Yeah. And what's so beautiful about that metaphor, and so tragic, I think, to a degree, is that the horizon is a fixed, non-fixed position. Meaning, you can never approach the horizon. The horizon is always exactly as far away from you as it is right now.
Yeah.
You take 2 steps forward, the horizon is 2 steps further away. And that kind of distance, I think in the context of that book, at least in my interpretation of it, which I would argue is in keeping with Alice Walker's interpretation, so, I feel like I'm in good company there, is that the whole fucking point is to be moving forward and always working toward a form of self-actualization.
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous. I find myself often falling into a kind of fatalism that sees this idea of the revolution or whatever it being as the horizon. And it's like, well, it's fucking pointless to keep trying this or doing that. We're never going to make it there. And I think it is healthy to recognize that movement forward is actually progress, Yeah. I don't know. I kind of lost the original thread that I was going for there, but it is easy to fall into that fatalism and just accept that the horizon is always going to be the horizon. We're never going to get any closer to it. And again, that's beneficial to the capitalist class. That's exactly what they want us to think.
Yeah, no, I I understand exactly what you're saying. Almost at the same time, though, I'm feeling that the acknowledgement of that idea that the horizon is like, you have to understand that before you can really make any progress.
Sure.
Well, that's maybe too simplified, but I think that it is true though, that you have to realize that like that you're not going to have a perfect revolution. That's a common theme that I feel like we've been running into.
There's no bloodless revolution for sure. I think like in the perfect conception of what a revolution would be, it would be purely a revolution of ideas.
Yeah.
And it would be what's the word? Like there would be a nonviolent transference of power, and everyone would just understand, and consensus could be reached easily. That's a perfect revolution. That's never going to fucking happen, but that's no reason not to pursue it.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page here. I think we're on the same page here. I was trying to look forward into, there's something where he's talking about the absolute truth.
Well, that might be around where he's talking about Heraclitus very early. Much about Heraclitus?
No.
What I know about Heraclitus as a Greek philosopher is he said, you never step in the same stream twice. The idea being that everything is constantly in flux.
Yeah.
And that there's a fluidity to our life, our conception, our understanding, the world, in a point that, you have to accept that kind of ever-changing nature.
Yeah. I found the quote.
Okay.
I mean, it's hand in hand exactly with what you're saying, though. It says here on page 54, this is in chapter 2. Human history is a process of evolution, which by its very nature cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. On the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historical knowledge embracing everything and final for all time is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectical reasoning. And I think it's that exact thing that we're talking about. It's like to plant the flag and say that we're at the end, that we're at this final stage is a fool's errand, because there's always that continuous development. Even if you were to reach that point, it is now the beginning of a new point. It's just it's the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, whatever. And I even wrote down there, it's kind of feels like have you ever heard of the infinite coastline problem?
No.
It's this idea in maybe cartography that you can never map perfectly how a coastline looks. The further you zoom into it, you only get more and more detailed of a scraggle.
Oh, it's like trying to plot the number of points on a circle kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. It's that same exact problem, and regardless of whether you're zooming in or zooming out, there's no finality. There's always more out or more in, and I think that it goes hand in hand with that development of thought that Engels is referring to here, like early on when he says, nature works in this way where you cannot have a finality. A great example is when we're looking for at what point an animal has died. And he even makes a really funny point for 1845 or whenever this was, where he says, people have racked their brains trying to find a rational limit for when the killing of a baby in the womb is considered murder.
Yeah.
He
does. I marked that line.
Of course. Like that was striking to me, because this was a fucking million years ago. It's on the page before 52. They have cudgeled their brains in vain to discover a rational limit beyond which the killing of the child in its mother's womb is murder. It's just as impossible to determine absolutely the moment of death. For physiology proves that death is not instantaneous momentary phenomenon, but a very protracted process.
Yeah.
It feels the same. Like it's this continuous process that we've been talking about since the beginning, the continuous withering away of the state, that one hair left on the man's head before he's gone completely bald. It's that same thing. Like
Ship of Theseus kind of shit.
Yeah. We're building communism, but to say that like we're at the high stage of communism is silly. It's silly.
Yeah. I feel like I'm just in a certain type of mind today, but that very much feels like it's foolhardy to say with anything with absolute certainty. Yeah. And I think from a purely Socratic notion, one should acknowledge that the only thing you know with certainty is that you don't know everything. Yeah. And so like this idea that it's like, we have made it, this is the final stage, this is the final form, that feels like very foolhardy to me to believe that that's even an attainable conception. Yeah.
I mean, I think it leads into chapter 2, which I think we can start getting into, but it's that continuation.
How do you say old dude's name? Fourier?
I thought it was Fourier.
Fourier. It's probably Fourier.
There's like a concept like...
I think of that air sound in French as having the E at the end.
Yeah.
And no E at the end is an A. It's like, I made a Breakfast Club reference earlier when you said it, and I don't know if you caught it, but Moliere.
I didn't.
Okay. Anyway...
The reason I've heard of him before is because is this the same guy? There's something in math that has to do with him, some kind of transformative property. I don't know.
I think he was a physicist.
Maybe. I'm not going to be able to glean the answer from this Wikipedia page right now, so.
The interesting thing in the context of our conversation that we're having now about understanding these final forms and maybe idealizing the idea that there is such a thing as a perfect revolution or a perfect communist quote state,
right,
is that it seems that what Engels is suggesting, Fourier,
we got to find out. Okay, I'm going to get a translating thing.
I'm sorry to all of the French listeners.
I'm not.
Fourier. That sounds like real.
Fourier.
Okay, well, anyway,
yeah.
Fourier seems to agree with this notion, and what it seems that Engels is suggesting was his primary kind of conclusion. 5 in chapter 1, where Engels is kind of summarizing his contribution, Fourier's contribution. He says, he lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world, and he continues on later down. He points out how everywhere the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases. And I just think that that's an interesting connection to make to this idea that we can speak idealistically and all of that about this supposed thing that exists, even though it's very obviously not like the reality that we're facing.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? That's what it's all about. And they did it. Just look at French history. As soon as they started saying that, they achieved it. No. But I agree with you. One thing that's interesting is it's very cyclical, obviously. That's something that he says Fourier talks about as the cycles of history. Mm-hmm. I'm stuck in that thinking about cycles, like the beginning and the end being the same point on a circle rather than the ends of a line. I
think something that I think is a byproduct of us reading these things in the order that we're reading them in is that I'm making a lot of connections to the Lenin that we've read while I'm reading this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of interesting. It seems quite clear where Lenin is getting a lot of the kind of seeds from which the fruit of his theory is being born, as a weird metaphor. But I think we got the first one that I really caught anyway in chapter 1 on page 46.
Okay.
Engels writes, with constantly increasing swiftness, the splitting up into large capitalists and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class, an unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population, now led a precarious existence. That, for whatever reason, brought to my mind the conversation around imperialism and how the colonization of foreign lands almost like created this middle class by creating a new class in precarity, and how that it continued to kind of create these stratifications within the class structures that already existed. And I just thought that was an interesting connection. It also bore the same question in my mind that I have all of the time, which is what is the level of precarity that bears revolution? Because at some point, we don't have artisans and small shopkeepers anymore that are really, the sort of petty bourgeois that we might think of today. It's harder and harder to make a living, subsist a living in that sort of situation. So like this idea that there is a level of precarity that will snap people into revolution. What is that level of precarity? I want to know. I know that that's an unanswerable question. But, I just read that there's wider income inequality now than there was at the time of the French Revolution when people did decide to revolt. So it's like, where is that line? Because I want to find it.
Yeah. I don't know. The thing is that like the ruling class can see these contradictions widening, and I'm certain that they're aware of what happens otherwise. So it's not like the new innovation comes into play to create a new middle class, essentially, right? To prevent that revolution from happening. And I think that there are mechanisms put into place to alleviate that revolutionary pressure. And what those mechanisms are ultimately doing is widening the middle class in a scenario where it is shrinking, right? I mean, that's what we've been seeing constantly for the last 100 or so years, is that the middle class is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking.
Yeah.
And the only times where that is reversed is times where essentially a larger middle class is created. I mean, just thinking of like the social programs and job guarantees that were given during the New Deal, those were all things,
or whatever.
Yeah, those were all things that lifted people up back into the middle class, because before that point, what was happening, right? They were all being proletarianized. The only option was to work in the factory or whatever. And then because of, at the end of that cycle, that overspeculation, right, the crash happens, were not lucky by any means, but what essentially breaks that cycle from happening is the profits of the war. You know, the New Deal happens. We do New Deal programs to prevent revolution. And then our asses are saved by the fact that the war profits are juicing our shit up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry to put that so bluntly, but it's because it's true.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we turned on Russia immediately.
Yes. It's pretty great. It's pretty great.
It's pretty great.
It's that fucking back and forth, like that same history book, dude. I don't think it's fair to say like one party is responsible for the war because they're looking, both the Soviets and the US are like looking at the actions of each other and ratcheting it up. Well, it is possible to say who's responsible because the Soviets, at least initially, did want some sort of cooperation, whereas the Americans almost immediately were like, oh, just kidding. This is our enemy, the true enemy, even though we were just fighting literal genocidal Nazis.
Yeah, thanks for the help. Here's a knife in the back.
Yeah. Okay, let's get off of that train.
Chapter 2.
Dialectics. It's a big one. It's a good one. Just to start us off with a quote. I love this bit right here at the very first page, 50. We see, therefore, at first, the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and that are connected.
It points out to what I would call Engels' working definition of what dialectics is, which I think he articulates, for me as a layperson, it was best articulated on page 54.
Okay.
Where he says that it is effectively a mode to, quote, trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development that happens throughout history. And that it allows us to find a, quote, inner law running through all of its apparently accidental phenomena. So I don't know, what I was taking from what you quoted there at the start of the chapter is this kind of idea that if you zoom out, you can see that there are connections historically that put it all together into a logical, scientific form of reasoning rather than what he often calls the kind of anarchy of the way we see it happening now.
One thing I really appreciate here is on page 51 and 52, Engels kind of gives the history of how we got to this point. It's based off of this rational method, right? This idea of like observation and isolation, hypothesis, etc.
He name drops Descartes and Spinoza for my philosophy nerds out there who were rationalists. Mm-hmm. So makes sense.
I gotcha. So what I love here is, this is at the bottom of page 51. This method of work has also left us as legacy the habit of observing natural objects and processes in isolation. When this way of looking at things was transferred by Bacon and Locke from natural science to philosophy, it begot the narrow metaphysical mode of thought particular to the last century. So I love the idea that we're expanding this natural science, like this very rational, very scientific method, where it's being expanded past the natural sciences into the field of philosophy. But what's outcoming of that is this very weird and stilted idea, right? He says on the next page, this is thinking an absolutely irreconcilable antithesis, right? A little further down, cause and effect stand in a rigid antithesis one to the other. Okay, so just to continue, the metaphysical mode of thought sooner or later reaches a limit beyond which it becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions. And that really spoke to me because I kind of get this feeling sometimes when you're reading philosophy where it's like, this is fucking, this is metaphysical jackoffery, like, what are you really saying here? Is this anything besides mumbo jumbo that you're just making up? I think that thinking comes from that place of extension. You're extending these logical ideas to these things that maybe require a different mode of thought. And what you're getting out of it is these really ridiculous observations, observations that, as you're trying to put into words, sound so absurd that it's jumble, okay? In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and the end of that existence. Of their repose, it forgets their motion. It cannot see the woods for the trees. I think that just really summarized this whole thing for me. It's that we're not looking at the individual piece, but the connections between the pieces. That was really when it clicked for me in this chapter.
I already mentioned the bit on 54, but there is another section on 56 that I think was kind of putting it together. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really still fully understand what base and superstructure and all that sort of stuff is. I think maybe when we get into reading Marx, I'll get that a little bit more. But he is continuing along this same sort of thing in his chapter-long definition of what dialectics means. He says on page 56, then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles, that these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange. In a word, of the economic conditions of their time, that their economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of a given historical period. And so, to your point, expanding it like where we're now able to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, that zooming out, I think we have a tendency historically to always think in modes that he names here. We think of political phases or eras. We think of religious phases or eras. And what he's saying is like, you're missing the fucking point, because inside of those is the real mode that's carrying this connection through history, which is the economic modes that created the conditions for those other things to occur.
Yeah, we've said so many times about like talking about treating the symptom. And I think that that's kind of just a shorthand for what Engels is saying, where he's saying that if you can understand the causes of this society, if we want to change society, then you have to change the causes. I know that sounds simplistic to say, and that's because it is. But the problem is that our thinking before this point has not allowed us to see that cause, right? We've been looking at essentially the effect the whole time and just trying to replace it with another effect, when in reality, we need to be focusing on the cause behind it. And what Engels says Marx's contribution is that he's discovered the cause, the root of that cause on the very next page. These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. Under that, I'm sorry to say, I wrote, I guess we got to read Capital.
All volumes?
No, yes. We're just going to have to hit it chapter by chapter. This next week, I think we'll read chapter 1. No, not, I don't.
I think he does even name, maybe I was reading something else, but I think by the time he gets through here, he's quoting from the first volume of Capital.
He quotes from volume 1 of Capital and the volume 3 of Capital.
Okay. Coming back to your point, I have two things to say.
Yeah.
One of which is maybe a hot take, but
hit me.
I think all great ideas in history seem self-evident once they're articulated. Yeah. And so that's proof that it's a great idea. That it's like, of course, that makes perfect sense to everybody. Why didn't we think of that? So I think that like to call the idea simple is a compliment in many ways. Second thing I would say is in defense of the idea of this mode of dialectical materialism, this mode of thinking of the kind of economy and the modes of production as being the thing upon which all historical eras hinge. I think he names religion intentionally. Again, Engels seems very anti-religion in everything that we've read. I would suggest this. What's the way to say it? I had it in my mind formulated a moment ago. You could not have the economy that we've had without the peasantry. Mm-hmm. You could have it without religion.
Yeah.
Could you have had Christianity without the peasantry? Like, I think it hinges upon the idea that there is a beleaguered class. There is a beleaguered group of people that requires saving, that requires a savior. If you, Christianity hinges on the economy in a way that the economy does not hinge on Christianity.
We kind of talked about this before, where religions are still, at the end of the day, birthed from the circumstances around them, right? I don't know. There is definitely something to that. I mean, throughout history and in the modern, there's much ink has been spilled about the hand-in-hand effects of the Protestant work ethic and capitalism.
Yeah.
But
ink and blood.
Yeah, no joke. But I think, even in history, I'm curious as to whether like the shifts from like polytheistic to monotheistic religion align with market shifts, There is an example that I am a little familiar with, and it's the development of the printing press and Protestantism.
Yeah.
Like that was in a sense an industrial revolution that led to an evangelical revolution, right? Or an ecclesiastical, I don't know what you would call that. So I think there is something there. I just am not familiar enough to talk on it,
It's an undeveloped thought, but it's one that I certainly have in the back of my mind, and I'm curious to, weigh it.
Well, it's such an interesting discussion, because what I was going to say is that there's a line of thought that's like, religion has done nothing but hold us back for the last hundreds of years, and a part of me agrees with that thought for obvious reasons. There's also a counter thought that says so much of this development and retention of knowledge, think about like the way
the printing press is a good example.
Yeah, the way that books were even created before the printing press was reliant almost exclusively on monks, so position of religion throughout history is one that is both incredibly interesting and incredibly complex. I don't think it's fair to say that it's one way or the other because, I don't know, it's hand in hand with the development of history. Religion developed in its own right alongside a historical development. And I think that maybe further examining the parallels between those two structures might lead to some interesting revelation.
I'd read that book.
I hate exposing myself as a Chapo guy, but Hell on Earth is about that very thing.
Really?
The 30 Years' War, the birth of capitalism, essentially, and it has all to do with the schism, the Protestant I guess that's the Reformation, it has to do with Martin Luther, Martin Luther was a big shit poster. And he also,
quite literally,
yes. He also died of a bowel obstruction. He literally was a shit poster. Yeah. And he shat himself to death.
What a way to go.
Hell yeah. So chapter 3 is a big one. Historical materialism.
Yeah.
Just to talk about earlier when you said that they were devout Hegelians. They kind of moved past the Hegelian ideal, I suppose, in two ways. One, they do a little criticism of Hegel in here, where they're talking about the inverse of the structure. I think they are doing a bit of movement past what Hegel is explicitly saying. That's kind of this synthesis here, the historical materialism, where they're taking a materialist aspect of it, but it's that dialectic thought that undergirds all of it. The dialectics of it is the process that they're looking at. They're looking at the connections between the cause and effect. And that cyclical motion of history, that's where the dialectic thinking is taking place here. A lot of that, though, is it's hand in hand with what they're saying is a materialist outlook. One thing I was looking for is that he says that materialism has such a robust method to it, looking at what comes before, essentially, that it doesn't require a philosophy to stand at its front, essentially. I think they talk about it as like a queen of philosophy.
Yeah, I think I found maybe something that you were after with the quote for Hegel. It's at the end of chapter 2 on page 56. Because he says, this is in the middle paragraph about halfway through, Hegel has freed history from metaphysics. He had made it dialectic, but his conception of history was essentially idealistic. But now idealism was driven from its last refuge. The philosophy of history, now a materialistic treatment of history, was propounded, and a method found of explaining man's knowing by his being instead of, as heretofore, his being by his knowing.
Yeah, so that's the difference here between Marx and Engels' historical materialist thinking here and what Hegel's thinking is, because Hegel was an idealist. That's the deal. They're operating in a materialist lens. Hegel was operating in an idealist lens. However, it's not about that portion that's important. It's the fact that the dialectics are important because it's the process of understanding the connections rather than the individual. But we're not looking at it through an idealist lens. We're looking at it through one that's materialist. That's all.
Yeah, I think maybe this muddies the water, but the way that I would think of it is that like dialectics is the tool that Hegel gave them, but they're using it to shape something different.
Yes. Yeah. They even say that, man. I wish I could find the section now. Here it is. That the Hegelian system did not solve the problem it propounded here is immaterial. So it doesn't matter that Hegel ultimately didn't come of anything because its epoch-making merit was that it propounded the problem. The problem is one that no single individual will ever be able to solve. So again, it's that collective effort, which maybe mirrors what we're talking about in a moment here about the social production, Okay, although Hegel was the most encyclopedic mind of his time, he was limited first by a necessary limited extent of his own knowledge, and second by the limited extent and depth of knowledge, the conceptions of his age. Here you go. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not more or less the abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things in their evolution were only the realized pictures of the idea. So just what they were saying before is that the knowledge doesn't make the being is what makes the knowledge. And that inversion is the primary difference between Hegel's philosophy and Marx and Engels. That was a real struggle, but we got through it.
Yeah, I think that that's well said. And I think that you can't fault, like Engels, do not fault Hegel for having that conception. I think it is a very Platonic conception, again, to come back to Plato and the idea of forms. I think that is a Platonic ideal. Hegel was building from that. And like all good principled philosophers, Engels and Marx look at what Hegel offered, and then they build from that.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense in the continuity of thought.
Yes. Historical materialism. That's what we're talking about here.
If it hasn't been made clear up until this point, I think he opens chapter 3 with a pretty good working definition of what historical materialism is, suggesting in the first paragraph of the chapter that from this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought, not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange.
Yeah. Just to follow that up, I even love not the next sentence, but the one after. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason, and right wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange, changes have silently taken place, with which the social order adapted to earlier economic conditions is no longer in keeping.
Yep.
So I even love that idea. It's like we're seeing the antagonism between the social order and these systems that were created already. Right, we're already seeing the point being proven, because our discontent with these systems is the fact that the systems were created for a previous society, whereas we are now in a new society and thus require new systems. I do declare. But yes, that was a very modern taste there, I feel. Is the idea that like we might be fed up with these systems, but that totally makes sense because they are literally old systems. Right? Changes in society have happened. Those are things that we already know and we already recognize. And thus these systems must be reflective of those changes. And the fact that we're so pissed off is that they're not.
Yeah, I think he closes that paragraph. I love the last line of that paragraph there. He says, these means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production. So just like you said, I think he's articulating there that it's there to be seen, it's there to be understood based on the existing systems that came before. And we recognize that contradiction now that we've moved past the need for those old systems, antiquated systems, whatever you would call it.
Yeah. This whole chapter lays out a really fantastic historical development. If you're asking yourself, how did we get to this point? I think this chapter actually is very enlightening. Just to kind of give an overview about what Engels is saying in this next section, he's saying that production was socialized. So just to kind of go over it, the thing that Engels is saying is happening is that we're moving historically from individual means to socialized means, right? Those socialized means of production, i.e., production that requires cooperative effort of many people, has taken over as the predominant means of production. In fact, it's the only means of production that's left. It outshines individual production on every level and thus takes over every industry. However, part of the anarchy of the individual production that led to the creation of commodities as the primary way of satisfying people's wants. And the issue arises because even though the means of production were socialized, the means of exchange were still individual. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is all what's in the chapter. I'm just trying to summarize here. That development, I think, is laid out really well here because he's saying that the socialized means of production and the individual means of appropriation are inherently contradictory. And that contradiction is the underlying cause of a lot of these issues.
Yeah, well said.
Sorry to ramble on there for a minute, but this whole section really just spoke to me because it just felt true, but like it is true. Mm-hmm. You see that industrialization happen throughout history. I even love on page 60 towards the bottom, socialized production revolutionized all old methods of production, but its revolutionary character was so little recognized that it was, on the contrary, introduces a means of increasing and developing the production of commodities.
Yep.
Think back to the very first episode. We talked about that exact thing. The Industrial Revolution is not seen as a revolution, right? It's seen as an increase in the means of production, right? It's seen as new technology, new ability of production. It's not seen as a literal upending of power. It's so much more clear now, having read this, to see exactly what Engels is talking about, because, of course, socialized production has a greater economic effect in terms of what it can produce, right? It can make more. It just requires that cooperation. And the fact is that the rest of the society has not changed on that same cooperative level.
Yes, and I think he's even kind of tiptoeing around the concept of alienation when he's talking about that contradiction that exists within the wage earner who is contributing to this creation of commodity while being completely separated from that commodity. He says at the top of 60, he says, in like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the production from the individual to social products. So there's that contradiction again coming to light through that alienation.
Right. How can you say that this is my product when you know that so many hands have been laid on it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's that exact thing. However, we still allow for that individual ownership, even though he even says here, there's a point where none of that individual production goes into the product. So how, like, it's all socialized production. There is no one piece that can go to the individual. So, like, how can you say the ownership goes to the individual?
Yeah.
You know, really, I mean, just fantastic stuff. He does lay out a bunch of different contradictions here, right? And they're all italicized. That's what I really love.
Yeah. They're easy to find.
Yeah, more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalistic appropriation. That's what we've been describing. Even further down, this is, I think, maybe what you were hinting at with a bit of alienation there. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as that antagonism. So the fact that those two systems don't work is part of the root hatred between the two classes. And then he even says the third contradiction on page 64, an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the anarchy of production in society generally. That one spoke to me because it's that teamwork that makes the product, but I don't know, that contradiction is an interesting one to me because there is an inherent organization inside of like a factory setting, inside of like a workshop, but it's contrasted against the way that the production is in society.
What I took from that one is this idea: an individual workshop has an intended purpose to build a particular thing for a particular client or a particular need. And so everyone understands, even if it's not a workshop of one person, but a workshop of, many artisans working together, or like a master craftsperson and their apprentice or apprentices, it doesn't matter. The idea is they know what they're building, they know for whom they are building it, and they set out to do so. In a factory environment, the quote anarchy that I think Engels is hinting at there with the anarchy of production in society generally is that they don't understand for whom they're building the thing. They probably don't even understand in a assembly line-ified form, might not even understand exactly what they are making.
Yeah.
So there's an alienation in that. There's an alienation in the complete separation of the product from the producer. And so I think, like, when he's talking about that contradiction there between individual workshops versus the anarchy of production in society in a larger space, that's what I see as the contradiction there. There's like a complete lack of understanding of whom it's for, and even if it's needed.
Right.
Because in a larger context, in a factory, you're mass producing stuff. Even if you don't know that it's going to sell, it's not being made to meet a need. It's being made to potentially become a commodity.
Yeah. Yeah. Even to add on to that, on the page before, I love this section at the bottom of 62 and the top of 63, exactly what you're talking about. The producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, for such an exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming to the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his costs of production or even sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns. So it's exactly that thing that you were just talking about there.
Yeah, there's another really interesting point on 62 that I'm not 100% sure I was interpreting correctly. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Because when he's talking, this paragraph that begins the first capitalist found, blah, 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 he's talking about the guilds of yore. He says the guilds were so organized that the journeyman of today became the master of tomorrow. Like, there was a very clear kind of line that you work as an apprentice to a journeyman to become a master craftsperson. And then you know exactly what your role is in, like, kind of communally, right?
Yeah.
He says, but all this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of capitalists. The means of production, as well as the product of the individual producer, became more and more worthless. There was nothing left for him but to turn wage worker under the capitalist. And then he goes on to say a few lines later, the wage worker for a time became a wage worker for life.
Yeah.
And I took that to mean this sort of, again, I'm thinking of it in this context of alienation the whole time I'm reading this chapter. And the more alienated one becomes with the product of their labor and understanding of what it is they're making, or even alienated as a byproduct, alienated from society because they no longer have a very clear kind of role. What is my role in this place? I'm no longer the furniture maker. I'm no longer the blacksmith. I'm just a person that fucking turns a crank. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, once that becomes so devalued that you become the only place you have is to become a wage worker to make commodities for capitalists. Once you step in, you cross that threshold, you're kind of stuck in it.
Yeah. Two things. So first off, I think that that's an interesting point, contrasting the factory wheel turner to the guy who's an apprentice for an artisan. You're not building the skills working at a factory to then become the proprietor at the end of the day. That's an interesting point that I hadn't thought of. What I think he's talking about here is what I was saying earlier, where the socialized means of production is just more efficient in producing. The power of the individual to compete in that market is more and more undercut until they cannot compete at all, right? The only option is to become a wage worker. And what he's saying there, where he says a wage worker for a time versus a wage worker for life, is actually, it's couched in something he said earlier, where he's saying that there did exist people who were hired, right? People who helped out to the individual worker, but they didn't work for a wage, right? Artisans is a specific example because he says they're working for the ability to become the master later on.
Yeah, the promise of becoming an artisan themselves.
So where he's saying that those people may have earned a wage temporarily, that's a wage working for a time. They're now forced to wage work. They have no other option. There's no artisanal prospects, I guess. They're a wage worker for life. When I first read that, that's what I had gotten from it. But interesting too, that division of labor is part of the issue itself as well. And I think Engels does mention that later, where he says that the division of labor is ultimately what leads to the division of class.
Yeah, I hadn't considered the competition aspect of that. It makes a lot more sense once you contextualize it that way. That it's like once production becomes socialized, there's no way to compete. We had this exact same conversation last time when I was talking about becoming a furniture maker.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like, you have two choices. You make
you CNC all your furniture out.
Yeah, or you make ridiculous high-end stuff for the 1%ers that can't be made in that kind of production mode. So, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I have a kind of related point. It's not getting to the exact same thing that you were talking about, but at the bottom of page 64 and on to the very top of 65, he's kind of talking about this vicious circle. He says, this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more a spiral and must come to an end like the movement of planets by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians, and it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. I mean, I wrote, I sure fucking hope so next to that.
Yeah. There's an interesting current here, and it's something that I think that it's a belief that Marx and Engels hold, that this like complete proletarianization of the masses will lead ultimately to the upending of the system, right? I think this is the first time I think we've read that in text directly, where he's saying that this continued oppression is essentially creating that mass base to then have revolution.
It's like a powder keg.
Yeah, and that's like a big part of modern Marxism is like, how did these things go wrong? That's like the flaw. One of the flaws, I guess, of Marxism is that they believe that it was inevitable in that sense. Well, not that necessarily that it was inevitable, but you know what I mean? That it was a little... I think what a lot of modern theory is trying to aim at is that it's like, why not? Why hasn't that happened yet? Much in the same way that Russia posed an interesting counterexample because it was an undeveloped economy, essentially, right? That it wouldn't be the same base of revolution that Marx had predicted. I think they're kind of hand in hand in the same sense. Where it's nice to see Engels committed to paper, but it like makes my heart wrench a little bit because it's like, well, why hasn't that happened? You know, this is only more true today. So what the fuck,
Yeah, again, what are the conditions that become the turning point, that become the point of no return, the point where revolution is the only viable response as opposed to...
Yeah. Well, again, though, it's in that cyclical nature. These next couple of pages all have a lot there. So actually, I think let's slow down a second because 65, 66, and 67, I think, are all really important.
Yeah, lots of stuff.
Yeah. So the quote you just read about, I think, is really interesting because it has to do with the position of technology. That technological advancement has to do with a lot of the expansion of capitalism. It is the compelling force of anarchy and social production that turns the limited perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect this machine more and more. Something there, it's like if you want to compete in the market, you have to use the most advanced machinery. That also lends itself to concentration because capital is the only one that can afford that kind of limitless expansion of the machinery as well.
Yeah. He also makes the point that it makes human labor superfluous there, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut in a previous episode, but that's the whole point, is that society has advanced their machines so much that all modes of production are mechanized. The only jobs there are the engineers that take care of the machines that make all of the stuff.
Yeah.
Again, I have alienation on the mind, I guess, but that's just another mode of alienation where you're like literally alienating the people from their labor by making them superfluous, making that labor superfluous.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes me think of what we were talking about a couple episodes ago, where it was in the Kropotkin episode on Conquest of Bread, where we were saying that taking part in the production itself only lends to your own advancement, right? Being familiar with every part of the process makes you better at producing.
Any part of it, yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of the opposite happening here, where we are removing people from the process. We're dividing it up so much that they're not gaining that same benefit.
Yeah, you lose sight of the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the question in my mind at this moment is that whether that's an effect of capitalist mode of production or if it's the effect of the socialized means that they're talking about. Like the fact that it's that cooperative effort, does that not alienate in its own right because you're dividing up the labor itself? I'm interested because I'm just thinking about like a factory where you're not just the guy pulling the lever, know, where you're still in a cooperative effort for producing something, but it's not alienating in the same sense that your only task, and maybe that's just as simple as a factory where you rotate around.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like in the context of the individual workshop, even if you have 10 employees or, 10 artisans working in this workshop, they might be devoted to a particular task for a given project or something like that, but that doesn't mean that's the only task that they can complete. And so it would be possible for them to do whatever is necessary to meet the order of the day, whatever it happens
that's
to be.
fair.
Woodworking is the analogy that's going to make the most sense to me personally. Like understanding how to cut a mortise and an adjoining tenon is certainly an important part of the process.
Yeah.
If that was the only part that you knew, you wouldn't be able to build a piece of furniture. Right. But like your understanding of how the mortise and tenon works makes you better at every other process too. So like there is something necessary to understanding each piece. And like you said, as simple as just rotating from one thing to another or learning multiple processes, I think is a solution to that alienation in a socialized sense.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that it was maybe I was just trying to figure out whether the socialized production itself is a contributing factor to the alienation. And I think ultimately the conclusion is no.
What I do think is interesting here is in the context of this conversation, that section on 65 where he says, thus it comes about, to quote Marx.
Yeah.
I love that he also never discloses his relationship to Marx in this text.
To quote Marx, the guy that I'm supporting actively, my best bud for life.
Yeah, and it just seems like, well, he's super smart. I'm going to talk about this guy. He never really is very transparent about that. But nonetheless, thus it comes about, to quote Marx, that machinery becomes the most powerful weapon in the war of capital against the working class, that the instruments of labor constantly tear the means of subsistence out of the hands of the laborer, that the very product of the worker is turned into an instrument for his subjugation. And I think here we are 170 years later and have a completely new perspective on this point with the onset of AI. I think like AI is supposed to be something ideologically that creatives can use to take care of mundane tasks. What it is a tool that's being used to replace creatives entirely, mostly through stealing their work and learning how to copy it. And so it's becoming an instrument of its own subjugation.
Even outside of that, just think about, I mean, you and I haven't gone through this, obviously, but the conversation about what jobs AI will affect. I think a lot of the fear-mongering, honestly, about AI will replace every job in 10 years is to create that kind of precarity. You know, it's this idea that's like, don't get too fucking comfortable, you wagey.
Yeah.
You know, because AI is going to come around and replace you. Like, that's
I can't do what I do.
That's a cudgel, dude. Like,
Yeah.
that's a cudgel. And, you know, I have a friend in tech and he's like, nobody's safe. And I'm like, I guess we just have to do Butlerian jihad. Like, I guess it's about fucking smashing these computers right now then, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've never read Dune, for the record. Sorry. You know, but what I said is that when I live in the Great Lakes neoconate, we will not allow microchips to happen. So, like, that's all I could really say is, like, what do we do against that? I guess we're fucking burning shit down.
Yeah. Just the great irony of some fucking middle manager that's entire job could be replaced by an Excel spreadsheet is the one telling people that their jobs are in danger.
Guess you got to learn how to code, man. But no, because AI will do that too, man, dude. Yeah.
Anyway, I just, from a modern view, I know that it's anachronistic to look at Engels and talk about AI, but like that seemed part of the kind of modern conversation around Marx and Engels is that, like, they predicted all this shit 150, 170 years later or previously. And like, I think here's a really good example.
I think, you know, I totally agree. And I think that part of the conversation, not to give credence to AI as it currently stands, because I think a lot of it is fucking smoking, you know.
Yeah, it's not as nearly as strong as they want you to believe.
Right. It's mostly smoke and mirrors at this moment.
Yeah.
But I do think that AI, or at least the conception of AI, is the newest technological innovation. You know, if we're talking about real world-changing technologies, the internet maybe was the last one.
Yeah.
You know, the smartphone, I guess. But after that, what is actually like a radical technology that might change our society? It's not Uber or fucking, like, those aren't actual technologies, but I think AI is at least maybe the next one. But yeah, I don't think that AI is an inappropriate example. That's all I meant by that. I do want to say, I love here, it's on page 64, advantages in natural or artificial conditions of production now decide the existence or non-existence of individual capitalists, as well as of whole industries and of countries. Mm-hmm. He that falls is remorselessly cast aside. It is the Darwinian struggle of the individual for existence transferred from nature to society with intensified violence. Mm-hmm. We can overcome nature, but we don't, you know? Yeah. I also love that he says that advantages that are natural or artificial. You know, it's not that this competition is born of actual advantage most of the time. A lot of the time it's, you know, as Lenin said, the genius of speculation.
Yeah. And to call back to Lenin again, I was thinking a lot about imperialism because I'm woefully behind all of the time. I'm usually doing the editing of the last episode while reading this. And so I'm thinking of the two things hand in hand. And this is another one of those points where I was making connections to Lenin. I actually quoted or highlighted the section right above this where he says the field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization following them multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between the individual producers of particular localities. The local struggles begat, in their turn, national conflicts, the commercial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. So obviously, the same conclusion that Lenin comes to, that capitalism begets imperialism because there's always going to be an expansion outside of one's borders. Mm-hmm. And I think that that comes back to the same idea that advantages in natural or artificial conditions, well, I mean, one of those advantages literally could be the resources that are available to you naturally. You know, they're called natural resources. Right. So I don't know. I just think that it's fun making the connections from text to text.
Yes. No, it truly is. I mean,
I'm a nerd. I like that.
Yeah, dude. Ugh, I hate taking notes, but I love it so much. Yeah. Just to keep talking on that, right? This is on page 66. The enormous, expansive force of modern industry, compared with which that of gases is mere child's play. There's a lot of comparison in this book to from, like, you know, what Engels is saying is like the correct thing to a natural force.
Wasn't his last book he was writing when he died? Wasn't it called
Dialectics
of
Nature? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I don't know nothing about it, but it's just very funny the way. I guess I suppose it's a rhetorical device at the end of the day that he's saying, like, it's so right, it's literally natural.
It's encoded in the world.
He does it a couple times. Like, there's one part here where he says, you know, to expect a different outcome from this capitalist production is like to disobey natural law. He says some specific ones about batteries or some shit. And I'm like, okay, nerd. But he says, compared to the expansive force of gas, the expansive force of modern industry, the gaseous expansion is child's play, but appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets for products of modern industry, but the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive, of the markets is primarily governed by quite different laws that work much less energetically. The extension of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable, and this cannot produce any real solution so long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production.
Yep.
So that was a very long-winded of just saying that, like, the cycle continues, the contradictions are intensified to the point of collapse.
Yeah, and I would even say there's a connection all the way back at the beginning of the chapter on page 59, where he's kind of, maybe he was foreshadowing this point, but he says this conflict between productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the mind of man, like that being between original sin and divine justice.
Yeah.
It exists, in fact, objectively outside us, independently of the will and actions, even of the men that have brought it on. So, I mean, I think in the context that he was saying that earlier, he was saying kind of like that this is going to take a life of its own and it's going to move in this way.
Yeah.
Once we get the ball rolling down the hill, it's going to continue to roll. But I think in this same sort of way, I'm seeing a connection here to him saying, like, it's even outside of the will of individuals that this is happening, because you see the same sort of things happening in nature.
Yeah. Just to extend that quote, I mean, I even love the next line: modern socialism is nothing but the reflex and thought of this conflict.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like the recognition of that fact is what literally has given birth to the modern idea of socialism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to continue on the cycle, the stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated masses of commodities finally filter off. So he's talking about the crisis of overproduction here. We've overproduced to the point of surplus. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. Hold on now.
I know an industrial trot.
Yeah, I know an industrial trot too. No. A headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so over again. One more thing. We have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times, and you'll never guess, it's 1877. So roughly every 10 years or so, he's saying that these contradictions are so strained to the point where there's nothing but collapse possible. You know, and I even love the kind of that late cycle of collapse where he's saying that, like, there's this insane speculation, you know, this boom, this bubble, essentially, that then must burst, you know, and even in modern times, we've seen that happen at least thrice in my life, you know. So what the fuck? What are we still doing here?
Yeah, crisis from plethora, or a crise pléthorique. Yeah, I just love that line at the top of 67 where he says, the mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. That's almost poetic, you know?
It's that invisible hand. Don't you know it?
Yeah, right.
Oh, I had a little bit more on 70 and 71. He does talk here. I think that in State and Revolution, Lenin is referencing specifically this part, perhaps. Okay. I think he does quote Anti-Düring a bit in that book. But it is nice to see Engels talk specifically about the withering away of the state.
I have that. Yes, that's
page 70 and 71.
Yeah, before we get there, just a quick thought.
By all means.
Because he says on page 69, this is the last line before that gigantic footnote. All the social functions of the capitalists are now performed by salaried employees. The capitalist has no further social function than that of pocketing dividends.
Yeah.
And I just appreciate, you know, him pointing out that a capitalist has absolutely no social function.
Right. They don't do anything. They tear off coupons, they gamble on the stock exchange, where different capitalists despoil one another of their capital.
Yeah, they just gamble with one another. It's
right.
What were we saying in the last episode? Not the redistribution. Yeah, it's the redistribution or whatever.
The redivision.
The
redivision of the world.
They're just the capitalists gambling with one another on the stock exchange to redivide their money among themselves.
Right. Yeah, fucking ridiculous.
Yeah. So I appreciated him calling those folks out. Yeah, but The withering away of the state, I even wrote that on page 72 next to a quote. So you have something earlier than that?
Yeah, I did a lot of highlighting on these pages 70 and 71. It's not anything new. I mean, it's stuff that we've talked about a lot, but much the same. The only way we can change this is by society openly and directly taking possession of productive forces. Active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively. So this another one of those I love here. He's talking about what we can do with the means of production once we have seized them. Mm-hmm. And he's saying once we grasp their action, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and by means of them to reach our own ends. The difference, this is further down, is that between the destructive force of electricity and lightning in the storm and electricity under command of the telegraph, right? The difference between a conflagration and fire working in service of the man.
Yeah.
So it's again, it's like, even in nature, we can see the difference in it's the same force, but just utilized in different ways. Much in the same way, we're saying to utilize the state to create our own ends here.
Yes, he says on 71 to that point at the end of the top paragraph, as long as we obstinately refuse to understand the nature and the character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long they master us, as we have shown above in detail. So we can either use these forces, these things, as a form of power and subjugation, or we can use them as, collectively as a form of uplifting one another.
Yeah, just to say, like the socialized production is already there, man. We're not going back to fucking anarcho-primitivism, sorry. Sorry, guys. Okay, but like it's already there. The cat's out of the bag, right? It's at we've opened Pandora's box at this point, so we might as well use these fucking forces for good rather than nothing, rather than for whatever, to produce the 6th brand of Pepsi.
I mean, that's why there's all that conversation around the abolition of the state and why the smash the state, abolish the state thing was so criticized by communists, is because they're like, it's here, that can be used productively, we might as well use it rather than just destroying it and then being like, well, now what?
Yeah, just to thumb your nose at power because it's power.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than to try to wield it. I mean, the counter argument might be that the wielding of the power changes the person.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that's what anarchists say, but that's what we're here for. That's what we're trying to do, is to figure out how not for that to happen.
Yeah, how to distribute it in a way that is not a corruptive force.
Yep.
That it is not a corruptive force.
Word.
I have on 72, after the little bulleted list, at the start of the next paragraph, the second line, as soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy and production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary.
Yeah.
That's basically exactly what Lenin says about the gradual withering away of the state.
Yeah, even later, the state is not abolished, it dies out. It dies out. I think that's just a great way of looking at it. And I had this thought earlier, too, when we were talking about a continual process, but there's no communism lever. You're not going to press the communism button. You might wake up one day and be like, oh, shit, we're in communism, guys. But if you're pressing the button and expecting it to happen, then I don't think that's... this is the same thing we said earlier, but it's not going to be that way. We will simply just have better and better society until it's like, oh, we're doing a communism, y'all. He does a great summary just to say, is this book worth reading? I mean, I think the answer is certainly. But even if you didn't feel like reading this abridged version of a much larger work already, you could, in fact, just read 75 to the end.
I was going to say, just read the last 3 pages and you pretty much get the summary.
I even highlighted it. This wasn't a note I was going to read, but just to say, here's the great place to start. He says on 75, let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution.
Yeah.
Did you have anything from those last 3 pages? Because it really is a summary.
I don't have anything from those last 3 pages. I have one other quote here.
Yeah.
On 73. the question of like, where is that line in the sand? Where is the point where revolution is the appropriate response and we have met the moment that it becomes? He says that talking about the anachronism created by these contradictions, it presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out to a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and with this of political domination, of the monopoly of culture, and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society has become not only superfluous, but economically, politically, intellectually a hindrance to development. This point is now reached.
Yeah.
And I just appreciate the clarity with which he's,
guys.
Yeah, that he's not like beating around the bush. He's just telling you like, here we are.
Yeah.
The time is now.
That's such an interesting question, right? If we're taking Engels' stance and we're saying that we've been in this process historically of production being socialized, there is a point he's saying where before that point, the means of production were not developed enough for revolution to happen. And so it's interesting for him to say, like, we are now past that point. What makes it tragic is the fact that it was
150 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and it's the question of like, at what point did the bourgeoisie become superfluous? Like, when were they not needed to, I guess, invest that capital to develop the means of production or whatever they did?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was maybe too generous of something to say. But when did they become
superfluous? Were they ever necessary? The answer is no. But
I'm curious if that's the question I'm posing here, though, is that if we're talking about the development of the means of production, is there a point before which we did need the bourgeoisie?
Yeah.
You know, what Marx and Engels might be arguing here is that it's that kind of interstitial period where the French Revolution happened, you know, where it's like the kingdom of reason was building up these productive forces or whatever.
Yeah.
Now we're moved past that point.
Before that turned into like robber barons and industrialists just fucking exploiting everyone.
The question of like when is an interesting one to me now.
Feels like a very, very narrow window.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, because it's like, no. See, I don't know.
Yeah.
Fuck, dude.
That's a fair question to think about because, yeah, you do need some, like you had said earlier, there is an inherent investment of capital in order to attain these means of production. They weren't going to make themselves. Right. You're not going to be able to industrialize out of thin air.
Yeah.
It comes from somewhere, but...
thinking now, like, about, even in, just thinking of Engels' own phases that he's talking about here, where there were individual producers with individual tools. Was it just a technological increase that created the ability for work to be socialized? I don't know. That's now a question in my mind, though, is that when did the bourgeoisie become superfluous? Besides the meme answer of immediately.
Yeah. At birth.
Yeah.
Never again!
Okay, yeah, well, so that was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels.
Hell yeah.
Good read.
Good read. Just to double back on this, did you think it was worth reading?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, if you're feeling lazy, you can read the last couple of pages. He does a good summary there.
I wouldn't advise it. I think of the writers whose work we've read so far, Lenin and Engels, I think, are the most engaging, and they write with a clarity that helps even an idiot like me understand some of the underlying presumptions that are necessary to contextualize the whole of like communist theory.
Yeah, I also would advise against it, just to be clear there. I think that, as we have said, you know, this writing is set up really well, even if it is excerpted. It's set up in a way that's pretty direct and simple to read. I mean, he's saying, like, here's two features of socialism, and then the third chapter is the blend of both. You know, that's pretty much it.
That's well said. Yeah. That's a good point.
I mean, yeah, he's saying this is where the idea of socialism comes from. Here's where we're using our new method, and here's what's come of it. The historical materialistic scope. And yeah, guess what, motherfucker? It's time. It's time for revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That point has now been reached.
It's been reached.
Do you have any lingering questions? Or what questions did this text bring up?
What questions did this text bring up in my mind? A lot of the same stuff, unfortunately. You know, what between then and now has prevented revolution from happening? What can I do to learn more about dialectical thought? That's pretty interesting stuff. You know, I feel confident now, but is this everything? Is that the whole shebang right there? Just the idea that we're looking at the big picture, the connections?
Yeah.
I'd like to get a little more Marxist philosophy out there. That might be an odd thing to say, but
I think, yeah, what this has raised in my mind is around the context of philosophy. I think when I was coming up studying philosophy myself, or in the limited capacity that I studied philosophy at the post-secondary level, Marx is often referred to as a philosopher, and I was always like, Marx is an economist. What are we doing?
Yeah.
We're calling him a philosopher. And the more that I read of communist theory, I see that there is a lot of it rooted in philosophical thought. It has a tendency to be really focused on Enlightenment era thinkers. Like he mentioned Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, a few people in
Bacon,
this.
Carlyle, all those people.
Yeah. And so like, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think of the questions that I have are like, where does this fit in the kind of whole context of the philosophical continuum? You know what I mean? And would having a deeper understanding of other philosophical thinkers that were maybe contemporaries to Marx and Engels help me understand more deeply where they were coming from?
Yeah.
They being Marx and Engels in this case.
Yeah, that's a question I have too. It's not necessarily related to this text, but I know that there are philosophical currents that run parallel to Marxist thought. Structuralism is one that springs to my mind, you know. But the question is, like, how much of those things do I need to understand in order to what benefit is the understanding of those things for my Marxist conception here?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of made reference to this earlier when we were talking about Hegel, but what philosophy is generally speaking, the whole of the philosophical canon is a response to the philosophy that has come before it or is happening contemporarily. I made a joke about it way back when, but like philosophers, most of what they write about is just shitting on other philosophers.
Yeah.
So like,
What it just made me think of, honestly, was the kind of, I mean, I think Camus is an interesting example because very famously, regardless of how he felt about the individual, he was very much in support of the French colonialism in Algeria.
yeah.
You know, what the fuck's up with that, man?
Yeah.
Like,
That's fair.
There's some weird hypocrisy there. Philosophy is something I obviously want to get more into. It feels really tough to jump straight into the middle of it, though. You know?
Oh, yeah.
And we've had this discussion before. I'm not about to go fucking read Aristotle or whatever.
Well, I made the classic mistake. I was like, well, I want to read philosophy. I'm going to start with Plato's The Republic. And I was like, what the fuck? But I think much like what our approach to this is, it's like you jump in the middle, read what, contextualize it as best you can. And the more that you read, the more that context becomes clear. Anyway, the questions that I have in my mind are around the continuity of philosophical thought and where Marx and Engels live in that, and how much understanding the context around them would help me dive deeper into their work. Anyway, That was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific.
Engels.
What are we reading next?
Shit. We are reading, we're doing more Lenin. We're going to read What Is to Be Done.
Yeah.
Which, we've made enough jokes about the title that I figure we should probably read it.
Yeah, we probably should. So I'm excited.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get some information about what is to be done in the modern era rather than 1912 Russia. We'll see.
I doubt it.
Ye of little faith. Okay. Lenin can do it all.
Hey everyone, Editor Aaron here. Just realizing while editing the episode that we forgot to ask you to send us feedback at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Any questions, concerns, thoughts, book recommendations, whatever. We welcome all feedback. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Okay.
Fuck. Why'd you do that, dude?
What?
You went, okay, and then you looked at me.
I was about to say bye. Okay.
Oh, were ya? Were ya? All right, bye, y'all.
Bye.